I honestly never realized that the Fatui might be needing new recruits. And they just lost 2 Harbingers. Huh. Anyway, one of the most curious things in Genshin's future narratives is the relationship between a Traveler and the Fatui. While they are the most prevalent antagonistic force in Genshin's Archon quests, there does seem to be an emphasis on creating relationships with members, whether allies or enemies, generic foot soldiers, or high-ranking members. So today, I want to expand on a theory. Well, more of a theoretical situation. In the Snezh 9 Archon quest, the Fatui will ask the Traveler to join them in their cause against the Divine. Without another option, the Traveler will be forced to work with the Tsaritsa to further their goals against Celestia. Given that after everything the Traveler has learned from the other nations, the Tsaritsa is the final piece of the puzzle they need to learn the truth of the world. I want to see the logistics and the possible narrative justifications for going through with this kind of plotline given what we know. I won't be diving into the future story itself, but instead the already established character motivations and themes that could be used to get to this theory. Disclaimer: this is a remake of an old video actually, where I propose the Traveler will join the Fatui as well. I'm just adding in more context and story themes that were introduced in 2.5 and 2.4. I'm interested in opening this topic further because while the Fatui are a background force, Hoyoverse sure is giving them the necessary story backings per character to make sure that they're compelling lore-wise, and I don't think this is without reason. Also, none of this is indicative of the final product, but without further ado, let's begin. Before I go into the lore reasons, let's go to the meta reasons on why I think the story is building up to be the Traveler allying themselves with the Tsaritsa and the Fatui. When I say they'll join the Fatui, I do also think that some Harbingers will be playable. Do I think all of them will be playable? No. Some might perish, and some might not even be interested in the fighting because of the nature of their profession. Sometimes villains are just meant to die to raise the stakes of the story. I also can't give you a list of Harbingers that I think will be playable, or if they'll even be continued to be known as Harbingers as the story progresses. What is most likely though is that the Tsaritsa is a playable Archon, given that even Raiden A, who began as an antagonist, became a playable character. It would be nice to see a diversion from the standard friendship is necessary for playability trope and just opt for a standard alliance that doesn't have to be all buddy-buddy. There are other in-lore hints about her future attitude towards the Traveler that I'll cover later. Additionally, in the Tevat trailer, we see several characters when their respective nations play. The pattern currently is that each of these characters are playable, so moving on to the chapters, we get more characters. Lynette, Linné, Janssen, and the character of the Snezhnaya chapter, Pulcinella, the 5th Harbinger. Pulcinella as a character was mentioned in Tartaglia's character story as being the one who hired him into the Fatui. Pulcinella took interest in Ajax after learning his destructive and combative behavior, and told him that if he wants to serve the Tsaritsa, he'll have to do it from the very beginning. Pulcinella also seems to be a curious character that understands Tartaglia's desire for combat all too well. Their one line in Tartaglia's background suggests that they have a formal way of speaking, interestingly enough. So if they were the ones to recruit the Traveler, it would be a good parallel to Ajax's recruitment and it would keep the trailer consistent. But also, they'd make a lot of money. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's dive into the potential story and in-lore reasons for the Traveler to team up with the Fatui and Snezhnaya's Archon quest. I said that the Traveler will join the Fatui in the future, but we need to understand the limitations of that statement. The Traveler joining the Fatui does not mean they'll become a Harbinger, and that doesn't mean they even have to like the Fatui in the first place. We are not going to deny the atrocities and disgusting behavior the Harbingers have shown to the other characters affected, and we can only pray that the Traveler's moral ground doesn't have them excuse those actions completely. So if the Traveler does ally themselves with the Fatui, it might initially be out of pure necessity. But for an alliance to work, there has to be a good reason. We need to understand what benefits the Traveler could have for joining the Fatui, and what benefits the Fatui have for asking the Traveler in the first place. Out of the two, this one is easier to answer by looking at the Fatui's actions in the story. The Traveler has already been asked at least 3 times to join the Fatui by 2 NPCs in Tartaglia, and it isn't without merit either. While the Traveler are enemies with them, given their organization's ideals and power hierarchy system, the Traveler would be an ultimately positive asset to the Fatui. There are 3 key reasons the Fatui would want the Traveler working under them. First is that the Fatui already recognize that the Traveler has a skill set that surpasses any other mortal. The Fatui have always sought after those with potential to become great. This isn't limited to just physical powers, but also intelligence and wisdom. When we look at the backgrounds of 5 known Harbingers, we know that 2 of them had the locked potential to surpass other mortals, 2 of them were visionless but had amazing insight into the scientific and economic prosperity of the Fatui, and 1 was rumored to be a legend that caused great fear in people's hearts. In the current story, the Harbingers already recognize the Traveler's potential, and those that underestimate them have paid dearly. Tartaglia understands that the Traveler at their full potential could rival even the Harbingers, which isn't uncalled for. The Traveler already beaten him and Signora, and that's without half of the other elements. As for the other Harbingers, it'll be a different kind of battle most likely. Regardless, the Traveler fits well amongst the rosters of the Harbingers, especially at this point of the story where they would have at least 6 elements. The Traveler's potential power is also a mystery, since we know they're otherworldly beings. Besides, I'm sure someone like Dottore would be interested in tampering with the Traveler's power, much like how Albedo has a series of tests for the Traveler to undergo through. What the Harbingers currently know about the Traveler is unknown, especially that the Traveler is so secretive. But if the Fatui even had an idea that the Traveler is some otherworldly entity that has a final, more powerful form, they would want to have that person somehow weaponized, or at least make that person fight by their side. Second is that their motives and griefs against the divine align with the Travelers. Authentic motivation is difficult to manufacture, so this one is a very important part. The Fatui were established to rival the heavenly principles, as evidenced in Signora's funerary mask and the mocking mask of the Pale Flame. Those that have gripes against the divine make for great members of the Fatui. Of course, all the Harbingers have different goals and methods to achieve what they want, and some are much tamer than others. But the Traveler's end goal of finding the truth of this world undoubtedly ties back to Celestia. The Traveler's past was already filled with turmoil given they woke up in a time Celestia purged Conria. This is furthered with the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles specifically trapping the twins in Tevat, furthering the Traveler's own animosity towards her. And finally, throughout their journey, the Traveler learns more and more about the harsh truths of Celestia. The Traveler always had underlying animosity towards the gods. Not the Archons, but those in the island in the sky. In Albedo's final experiment, he asks the Traveler,
"Have you ever considered that the world of Tevat may have a natural hostility to Outlanders?"
Both responses show the Traveler's perspective as such. And the third is that the Traveler is a threat. We all know the saying, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. When I said that the Traveler would eventually be forced to join the Fatui, there is a possibility they'll force them under the pretense of surveillance. When we get to Snezhnaya, it would be politically and militaristically improbable that the Fatui let the Traveler do as they please on their homeland. In other nations, the Fatui don't have the authority to personally apprehend the Traveler. But if you have someone who is basically your nation's #1 criminal and was responsible for aiding the death of a Harbinger and the disruption of multiple Fatui operations, you don't want them running around Snezhnaya free of any kind of surveillance. Plus, with them walking around with God knows how many Fatui insignias under their belt and the 8th Harbinger's mask, I'd be concerned with national security at this point. Traveler joining the Fatui means that several Harbingers would have a close eye on them, and that their movement is limited given they'll be under control. Even the Tsaritsa would be close enough to stop the Traveler in the event they go rogue. Let's assume that the Traveler and the Fatui have a mutual agreement, and that agreement frames it in a way that the Traveler would have access to the same benefits as a Fatui Harbinger. Think of this like the Resistance, where they became the captain of Swordfish 2 and have access to multiple soldiers. The Traveler being forced under an alliance would not only benefit the Fatui's power set, but also simultaneously be an underhanded reason to have Fatui agents stationed around the Traveler without the Traveler being able to fight back. Because after all, these are your soldiers, and it wouldn't be morally and legally right to kill your own, now would it? I don't doubt that the Traveler can explore Snezhnaya gameplay-wise, but the Fatui might virtually have eyes and ears over the whole nation. With how they treat other nations, movement in Snezhnaya from a story standpoint would be impossible to do incognito. On a side note, by this point, the Fatui would have realized trying to kill the Traveler isn't going to work. Assuming we fight even more Harbingers in the future regions, and we end up either beating them or killing them, I'm sure the Harbingers would have realized that a more diplomatic approach is better. I mean, they're Snezhnayan diplomats. They're not supposed to go for the kill immediately. Aren't they political figures? But now let's go to the harder question. Moral obligations and repercussions aside, we need to determine what possible benefits the traveler has to even joining the Fatui in the first place. So let's dissect that idea. Given how the story becomes less of finding our sibling and more about understanding the truth of the world, knowledge is the most important resource to everything that the traveler does. Knowledge is, and has always been, the primary motivator of why the traveler goes through Tevat. The primary mysteries of this game is the nature of Conria and the Cataclysm, and the Fatui could be the primary source of information. This is the Fatui's best bargaining chip for the traveler to accept their proposal. Not only do we need access to the Tsaritsa's insight, we also need a way to carry over to the endgame story of Celestia and Conria, given that this is the last Tevatian nation. With what the traveler knows, or rather, what they don't know, it seems that most people that know about Conria prefer not to speak about it. The Archons are dismissive or unknowledgeable, and most reading pieces they've read are either vague, lackluster, or straight up illegal. In the Fatui, we know 3 people that could give us insight into the Cataclysm. Piero the Jester was someone that witnessed an ancient civilization be punished for their sin, and while it was never name-dropped as Conria, the Fatui were established after the Cataclysm and their fight is against the heavenly or foundational principles of the world. The Tsaritsa might also be more open to speak up about Celestia to the traveler, as opposed to someone like Zhongli. The Fatui Harbingers individually also have information that extends beyond regular citizens. For example, Vittoria has been tinkering with Conrian technology, and Tartaglia has access to abyssal techniques and combat mechanics. So just learning this information from character stories or whatnot, assuming that the traveler doesn't kill any of them, would help further the plot. Now, let's assume that this does succeed and the traveler actually does join the Fatui. One way or another, let's tackle what will happen. In all honesty, the Abyss and the Fatui are competing over who gets to rebel against Celestia first. Both factions have the basic premise of anger towards Celestia, but are just targeting different aspects of Celestia's rule. The Fatui deal with the heavenly principles, while the Abyss want to topple the divine thrones. While both are relatively vague terms that haven't been expanded on, it's safer to say that the heavenly principles are the foundation in which Celestia expects humanity and the world to act upon. They did nuke Conria under the pretense of these principles. From a gods versus humans perspective, the Fatui are leaning more towards humanity's perspective of a god in general rather than targeting the injustices of the Cataclysm. So while there are overlaps, the Fatui targeting foundational principles relates more to how the gods deal with humanity's personal turmoil despite being allegedly omnipresent deities. In relation to the Traveler, there haven't been any hints that the Abyss and the Fatui would have an alliance, so the Traveler might have to go through one faction before the next one. The only overlap we know so far is Piero and the Tsaritsa, with Signora's backstory hinting that she hates the monsters of the Abyss, which makes it a good stepping stone before Conria's chapter. Snezhnaya would be the ultimate culmination of what the Traveler learned from the other 6 Archon chapters, put together into a final act of disobedience and retribution. But here's the more important stance. What about the Traveler's moral obligation to the other nations they knew were terrorized by the Fatui? With everything that the Fatui did to the Traveler and the people of Tevat, it would be a massive disservice to characters like Jean, Diluc, Kokomi, Zhao, Tepe, and Ningguang, and many, many more for the Traveler to just join the Fatui. It would be seen as a betrayal of trust. But the question is, would the Traveler prioritize their friendships over the potential of finding the truth of this world? That question is difficult to answer. So instead, I'll be analyzing how the Traveler talks to characters that were once antagonistic, and let's see if we can draw conclusions from that. First is that the Traveler seems to prioritize an individual person over an organization. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take Enjou for example. Enjou is an Abyss Pyrolector, which immediately causes for alarm. But the Traveler is still willing to listen to him and even entertain his ideas. This evolves to the point that Paimon accuses the Traveler of coming to an understanding with Enjou. This also does extend to Tartaglia and the Traveler's camaraderie, in which the Traveler does understand the pains of being a sibling and doesn't immediately kill Tartaglia on the spot for everything he's done. Additionally, in the world quest A Very Special Fortune Slip, the Traveler befriends a Fatui agent that was going incognito and even convinces her to follow a path outside of the Fatui. The identity of a person to the Traveler isn't just limited to their status. I'm willing to bet that this would be why a new party like Pulcinella would be the best way to recruit them into the Fatui. If Pulcinella is first introduced in Snezhnaya, then the Traveler would have no real bias against them as a person. Yes, by this point the Traveler would have been exposed to all the war crimes of the other Harbingers, but if Pulcinella gives them a good enough reason, they might consider the alliance, which carries over to the next attitude the Traveler has. They understand when an alliance is needed for the present moment. 2.2's story with Shikitaisho is a great example of this, as well as the Enkanomiya event quest in 2.5. The Traveler begrudgingly listened to Enjou's story because they had no choice, and in 2.2, they accepted Tartaglia's help because he was a capable fighter and is already at the scene. This was also how they treated Tartaglia in the Archon quest. While they were first apprehensive that Tartaglia is a Fatui Harbinger, they still do form an alliance with him because it benefited both at the time. They needed a sigil of permission to speak with the Adepti. If the Traveler were acting out of malice for the whole crew of Harbingers, especially since Signora kicked Venti and stole his gnosis at this point, they would have just avoided Tartaglia like the plague, but they didn't really have a choice. So, out of necessity, we might actually see a strained relationship with the Traveler and the Harbingers. And besides, it isn't like the Harbingers truly meddle in each other's work. While they do have their overlaps, there are divisions with each Harbinger spearheading specific projects. Plus, loyalty to the Fatui doesn't mean loyalty to the other Harbingers either. No one likes Scaramouche, and the Harbingers don't like working with each other, and are even open to insulting them. So unless the Tsaritsa directly orders the Traveler to work with other Harbingers, there would be no need for them to even breathe the same air. Oh, and speaking of the Harbingers. Alright, so let's assume that the Traveler does end up joining the Fatui. The Traveler at this point of the story would have received some form of animosity from the other Harbingers, especially if they defeated most of them from the previous Archon quests. But in the event that no Harbinger pops up in Natlan, Sumeru, and Fontaine, which is very unlikely, the Traveler would have still had a hand in stopping Signora and Scaramouche's plans in Inazuma, though they'll have no choice but to set their differences aside for the greater goals of the Fatui. Now, this is the final topic I'll be covering because this is actually what made me go with this theory in the first place. What about the Traveler's delusion? A delusion isn't completely restricted to elemental control. It can also manipulate a much darker energy as seen in the manga, which means that this could be another element to add to the Traveler's roster. But in my opinion, the Traveler wouldn't willingly want a delusion. Not only would it be jeopardizing their well-being, it would also reflect the atrocities the Fatui did in Inazuma that resulted in a friend's death. The Traveler is also very aware of how a delusion works, and that it can scar a person mentally and psychologically. But note that I said willingly. While I was doing this video, I realized that if the Fatui truly want to restrict the Traveler's movement, the delusion is the best weapon they have in keeping the Traveler down. This doesn't even need to be in the form of a vessel delusion. In the manga, we know that the substance inside a delusion can be injected into a person. First is that the delusions can also work as suppressants for magical powers. This is what happened with Signora's delusion. While the delusion did give her cryo abilities, it also made to suppress her actual pyro capabilities. Though this is a voluntary decision to seal off her power, the nature of delusions are quite vague. Second one though is through emotional suppression. We also know that the raw material of some delusions feed off of not only strong anger, but also distress and negative thoughts. Is it possible that a potent enough delusion could theoretically seal off the Traveler's powers temporarily, or just enough to subdue them? Now, do I think the plot would take it this far to manipulate the Traveler into using the power of a delusion by basically drugging them? I don't know. But at this point of the story, and given this very late into the plot, I wouldn't put it past Hoyoverse to use this kind of thing. But yes, these are all my insights and analyses into the topic of the Traveler joining the Fatui, though I do want to do an alternative storyline to Snezhnaya in the event that we don't join the Fatui. Maybe we join a resistance or something. Well, it's going to have a lot of parallels with Inazuma by that point, but it is what it is. So, what are your thoughts? Do you think the Traveler will join the Fatui as a final attempt to get the Tsaritsa's information, or do you think that they'll join someone else, or at least find a way into Snezhnaya without getting shanked by the Fatui's military tactics? But nevertheless, my name is Aster, and thank you for chilling with me.